Have you ever wondered what happens to a country after it cashes in its biggest growth spurt?
Mm-hmm.
Like imagine a country where in just a single generation, the average person's entire life arc is just completely rewritten.
Yeah, it's a massive shift.
Right. We're talking about someone whose grandparents maybe died of cholera at age 40 on like a rural subsistence farm. But now,
Now they're looking at a totally different reality.
exactly. Now they're living to see their 77th birthday. They're getting treatment for cardiovascular disease and, spending their days coding logistics software in an air-conditioned megacity.
Which sounds like science fiction, but it's not.
No, it's not at all. It's the actual documented macroeconomic reality for a really specific group of nations.
Yeah.
We spent so much time analyzing the explosive rise of developing economies, right? The bustling factories, the newly paved mega highway.
Right, the sheer kinetic energy of a society stepping onto the global stage.
Yeah, exactly that energy. But today, for this deep dive, we're looking at the morning after. What actually happens when that incredible once-in-a-history population bonus just finally runs out?
It's arguably the most critical structural transition a nation can make. I mean, demographics dictate the absolute ceiling of an economy's potential.
Right.
But what happens when the very scaffolding of that society fundamentally shifts? We're looking at nations that have essentially cashed in their ultimate demographic cheat code.
Yeah.
They've built the cities, they've generated the wealth, but now they're facing the deep structural hangovers of that rapid modernization.
And to anchor this deep dive for you, the listener, we've got our hands on a really fascinating piece of research. It's this incredibly dense analytical presentation deck.
Super specific.
Yeah, it's titled The Transformation and Challenges of Late Demographic Dividend Countries, Deep Insights Based on Macro Data. And it focuses on what researchers categorize as the LTE country group.
Right, the late transitioning economies.
Yeah. And I actually need to establish the aesthetic of this research right off the bat because the designers made a very deliberate choice here. It really sets the tone for everything we're about to discuss.
The visual framing is striking, honestly.
It really is. There are absolutely no flashy graphics here, like no stock photos of smiling workers, no bursting 3D pie charts, nothing like that.
Thank goodness.
Right. It is built entirely on a stark, pure white background, like hex code FFFFFF white. The data is just presented in these flat, two-dimensional minimalist information graphics.
Using those low-saturation Morandi colors.
Yes. The sage greens, the dark brick reds, the stormy gray blues. The cover slide is literally just this pure white background with an abstract dark gray wireframe of a population pyramid.
Which is a brilliant choice. When you're mapping out the overarching fates of millions of human beings over half a century, I mean, the reality is inherently architectural. You don't need decorative elements. The researchers stripped away the noise to force an engagement with the raw structural geometry of these societies.
Right. They want you to just look at the bones of it.
Exactly. We're looking at upper-middle income nations that are currently caught in a massive historical pivot. Their fertility rates are hovering just above the replacement level, but the trajectory is, well, it's a definitive downward slope.
They're experiencing rapid aging and a shrinking share of working-age citizens. So, okay, let's unpack this. Let's look at the engine room of this entire phenomenon.
Let's do it.
When you dive into the data regarding the physical restructuring of the population, the numbers are just staggering. The macro data tracks two massive demographic plates shifting simultaneously.
Right, the working age and the youth.
Exactly. First, you have the working age population. And the researchers define this strictly as individuals between 15 and 64 years old.
Which is the standard demographic bracket.
Right. And over a span of a few decades, this group steadily climbs from 56.6% of the total population, all the way up to a highly specific peak, 71.5%.
Nearly 3/4 of the entire nation falls into the prime productive years. It's an incredible concentration of labor.
It really is.
And while that working age base is swelling to its absolute maximum, the second demographic plate is falling away beneath them.
The youth.
Yes. The youth population, so children from ages 0 to 14, it just plummets. The data shows it dropping from 39.01% of the population down to just 19.3%.
Wow. So it's effectively cut in half.
Exactly.
And the researchers map this out with this really elegant area chart.
Yeah.
It shows these two lines moving in opposite directions. And there's this stark little circle marker highlighting that exact 71.5% peak on the working age line.
With a little arrow saying, dividend window peaked.
Right. It's the exact moment the demographic stars align. But to understand the sheer economic horsepower this generates, we have to look at how these two shifting populations interact, right? The researchers call it the dependency ratio scissors.
Which is such a great term, because the dependency ratio is basically the foundational metric of a national economy's potential.
How so?
Well, specifically, the youth dependency ratio measures the number of children that the working age adults have to financially and socially support. In the early stages of the data timeline for these LTE countries, that youth ratio sits at a crippling 69%.
So, meaning for every 100 working age adults, there are 69 kids who need to be fed, clothed, housed, and put through school.
Exactly. And consider the sheer velocity of capital burn that represents. A society carrying a 69% youth dependency burden is spending a massive portion of its aggregate wealth merely on baseline survival.
Just keeping everyone alive and somewhat educated.
Right. Primary socialization. Think about the physical infrastructure required, the thousands of primary schools that need to be built, the pediatric clinics, the maternity wards.
The food.
Yeah, the sheer caloric intake required just to sustain that youth bulge. When a nation's capital is locked up in pediatric survival, there is virtually zero domestic liquidity left over.
So you can't build the other stuff.
Exactly. You can't fund deep-water ports or high-speed rail networks or advanced manufacturing facilities.
But then, those demographic scissors snap shut.
They do.
The data reveals the youth dependency ratio dropping off an absolute cliff. It falls from that 69% all the way down to 25.3%.
Yeah.
And this is where I kind of think about the micro-level reality of this macro data.
What do you mean?
Well, it's like an empty nester dynamic, but scaled up to an entire country.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Right. Imagine a sprawling household where, over a decade, all the kids grow up, move out, and get their own paychecks.
And crucially, the parents aren't having any more babies.
Exactly. Suddenly, those parents look at their bank accounts and realize their disposable income has just exploded. They aren't constantly buying diapers and school uniforms and pediatric medicine.
Right.
They suddenly have the capital to fix the roof, buy a second car, or just start investing aggressively.
I'll actually take their analogy one step deeper into the macroeconomic reality.
Please do.
When you scale that sudden household surplus up to a nation of 50 or 100 million people, that disposable income translates directly into gross domestic savings.
Oh, wow.
The national savings rate skyrockets. Domestic banks are suddenly incredibly flush with deposits. And what do banks do with that unprecedented liquidity?
They lend it out.
They deploy it, exactly. Yeah. They offer massive low-interest loans to industrial conglomerates to build semiconductor fabs, to modernize agricultural machinery, to fund deep tech research.
So the money just flows into infrastructure instead of diapers.
Right. That moment when the dependency lines cross, when the working age cohort hits 71.5% and the youth burden bottoms out at 25%, that is the exact mathematical sweet spot for hypergrowth.
It's just this massive infusion of free capital that doesn't even require foreign debt. It's pure domestically generated leverage.
Exactly.
But looking at the trailing edge of this dependency data, the right side of the chart, there's a very deliberate warning sign.
The other side of the scissors.
Yeah. The youth dependency drops, but the old age dependency ratio, so the number of elderly people relying on those workers, it starts to slowly creep upward.
It does.
It moves from 7.5% and crosses the 15.9% mark. And the researchers highlight this specific 15.9% threshold with a stark red dashed circle on the chart.
That 15.9% mark is the signal that the macroeconomic hangover has begun.
But wait, let me push back on the severity of that for a second.
Yeah.
We are constantly inundated with headlines about the apocalyptic aging crisis, right?
Yeah.
Every day there's a new article.
Sure.
But structurally speaking, 15.9% doesn't sound inherently catastrophic.
Yeah.
Especially when we just said these same nations used to carry a 69% youth burden without completely collapsing.
That's a fair point.
So is that 15.9% really a flashing red light? Or is it just a manageable stabilization after a period of abnormal growth?
The danger isn't the static number of 15.9%. The danger is the velocity of the trajectory and, crucially, the nature of the cost.
Okay, break that down for me.
A child is a temporary liability who eventually matures into a tax-paying, producing asset. They eventually join the denominator of the dependency equation, right?
Right, they become the workers.
But the elderly cohort does not re-enter the workforce. Furthermore, the capital required to support an aging demographic is exponentially higher and structurally different than youth support.
How so?
Funding a decade of public primary school is a known, fixed, and relatively low cost. You build a room, put 30 kids in it, and hire one teacher.
Right.
But funding open-ended, late-stage, chronic medical care, sustaining long-term pension liabilities for decades, that requires a staggering amount of sophisticated capital.
Oh, I see. So that red dashed circle is essentially marking the expiration date of the demographic cheat code. The free capital generated by the absence of children is dried up, and a much heavier, permanent financial burden is being strapped to the economy's back.
Correct. However, the overarching triumph of these LTE countries is that they didn't squander that temporary window.
They actually used it.
They capitalized on it fully. They used the low dependency era to engineer an absolute economic miracle, which sets the stage for how they built their wealth.
And that wealth explosion is just profound. Slide 4 maps this out, and the data tracking their economic leap is almost difficult to comprehend if you haven't lived through it.
The GDP growth.
Yeah. We are looking at GDP per capita rocketing upward, expanding more than 13 times to surpass $11,914.
And that's in constant dollars, right?
Yes, measured in constant 2015 US dollars. So we are stripping away any illusion of inflation. This is a pure, unadulterated measurement of expanding purchasing power.
An expansion of over 13 times the original baseline.
13 times. I mean, if you're listening to this, just try to internalize that. Look at your own annual income right now.
And multiply it by 13.
Exactly. Imagine how that would fundamentally alter not just your lifestyle, but your entire psychology, your feelings regarding risk, safety, your future.
It changes everything.
But it's not just that the economic pie got 13 times bigger. The very ingredients of the pie completely changed. The data on slide 5 maps out a profound structural shift in how these nations actually survive.
We're talking about the rapid unwinding of the agrarian economy.
Right. The researchers use a highly effective visual here. It's this flat, 100% stacked bar chart, and you can track this solid block representing agriculture's share of the national GDP.
Where does it start?
At the start of the timeline, agriculture accounts for over 24% of the entire economy. But over the course of the demographic dividend window, you see that agricultural block shrink away to a tiny 6% sliver under a downward arrow.
Wow, from 24 to 6.
Yeah. Meanwhile, the service sector and modern industry expand massively above it to consume the rest of the chart.
And this structural transformation, it's so vital to understand. Because when 24% of your macroeconomic output is tied to agriculture, you are looking at a society that is deeply vulnerable to exogenous shocks.
Weather, basically.
Yes, a massive portion of the human capital is tied directly to the land. They're engaged in subsistence or low-yield commercial farming. The entire national economy is subjected to the volatility of global weather patterns and the brutal price fluctuations of raw commodity markets.
And there is a specific granular data point the researchers included that highlights this perfectly.
Yep.
It tracks agricultural raw material exports, and it shows them plummeting to just 5 or 6% of total merchandise exports.
That is the definitive marker of a nation moving up the global value chain.
They stopped selling the raw stuff.
Exactly. They stopped cutting down raw timber or picking unprocessed coffee beans or harvesting raw cotton just to sell at rock-bottom bulk prices to wealthier nations.
Right.
Instead, they start retaining those materials. They apply domestic labor and technology to them, and they export finished furniture, processed goods, and textiles. They transition from exporting raw geography to exporting human value.
Which is just, I mean, think about the sheer sociological whiplash of that transition.
It's incredibly fast.
Right. In the West, the shift from the agrarian model to the industrial and service economy took centuries. It happened over multiple generations, which allowed the culture and the institutions time to slowly adapt.
Generations of gradual urbanization.
But in these LTE countries, this 24% to 6% drop in agriculture happens in a single lifetime.
Yeah.
You have families where the grandparents' entire existence was dictated by the monsoon season and physical backbreaking labor, and their grandchildren are now sitting in climate-controlled server farms managing logistics for global e-commerce platforms.
And that rapid compression of the timeline drives the greatest human migration in history.
Urbanization.
Urbanization. When agriculture mechanizes, you no longer need 50% of your population working the fields. A handful of workers with modern combine harvesters can generate the caloric output that used to require thousands of manual laborers.
Right, the efficiency just skyrockets.
Which triggers what economists call the Lewis turning point. The surplus rural labor dries up, and millions of people migrate into incredibly dense urban megacities to fill the newly built factories and office towers.
But shifting from farms to offices doesn't just change the GDP, right? It completely rewires the daily life and health of the actual human beings doing the work. You can't just move someone from a rice paddy to a corporate accounting firm without fundamentally upgrading their capability.
No, you have to upgrade the human capital.
And that brings us to the next section of the deck, which is arguably the most fascinating part of the dataset. Slides 6 through 9. The massive, deliberate upgrade of the human being.
Yes, the formalization of the labor market.
The data here shows exactly how these nations formalize their workforces. It's mapped out on this cool dumbbell plot showing the starting and ending years.
Tracking the decline in vulnerable employment.
Right. The numbers show vulnerable employment shrinking from 47.4% down to 31.9%, while at the same time, formalized salaried workers jump from 49.2% to 64.2%.
We really need to define vulnerable employment to grasp the impact of this.
Yeah. What does that actually mean in real life?
The International Labor Organization defines vulnerable workers as typically own account workers or unpaid family workers.
So like informal gigs.
Exactly. It's the street vendor selling hot food from a makeshift cart. It's the cousin working off the books in a small family repair shop.
Yeah.
These roles offer zero macroeconomic stability.
Right, because there's no safety net.
None. There is no legal contract, no corporate health insurance, no workers' comp, and critically, no pension accumulation. So when a nation manages to drop vulnerable employment by over 15 percentage points and move the majority of its population into salaried roles, they're pulling millions of people out of the gray market and into the taxable, regulated, predictable economy.
And just the psychological shift of getting a predictable paycheck every 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Of having a legally mandated weekend.
Mm.
Of knowing you have recourse if you're injured on the job.
It changes how a population behaves.
Totally. Suddenly you have a massive new middle class that actually qualifies for mortgages and credit cards because their income is verifiable by a bank.
Exactly. But as you noted earlier, the modern service economy demands a different type of cognitive output.
You need different skills.
Right. You cannot achieve 13 times GDP growth purely through extensive growth.
Wait, what is extensive growth?
Extensive growth is just throwing more warm bodies at assembly lines. Eventually, you hit that 71.5% demographic peak, and the pool of new bodies dries up.
I see.
To keep the economy expanding, you must pivot to intensive growth. Every single individual worker must become exponentially more productive.
They have to work smarter, not just harder.
What's fascinating here is how deliberate that pivot is. This is the realization of the quality dividend. The quantity of labor has peaked, so the quality must compensate.
And the data shows exactly how these nations engineered that quality. It tracks a massive, coordinated education boom. Primary school completion rates shoot past the 90% mark, essentially reaching total saturation.
Everyone gets basic literacy.
Right. But the real leverage comes from the secondary education data. Slide 7 shows secondary school enrollment literally doubling during this window.
And the dataset highlights a crucial sociological achievement alongside this, the attainment of gender parity in basic education.
Yes. The chart shows this minimalist double line, one for boys, one for girls, and they perfectly converge and rise in tandem. They circle the endpoint to mark gender parity achieved.
Which is a massive macroeconomic unlock.
Because you're doubling your talent pool.
Exactly. You are no longer artificially restricting the intellectual capital of your nation to just half the population. When secondary education doubles and achieves gender parity, you are flooding the labor market with millions of literate, analytically capable minds ready to be absorbed by the expanding service sector.
But the upgrade wasn't purely cognitive. Here's where it gets really interesting. The physical bodies of the citizens underwent a transformation that is almost hard to believe.
The life expectancy data.
Yes. Slide 8 maps out the life expectancy data, and it is arguably the most striking metric in the entire deck. They plot this smooth curve with a shaded interval tracking average lifespans, and right in the middle, they draw a horizontal line with a specific gain, plus 33 years.
The jump from a baseline of 43.9 years to 77.1 years.
That is almost an entire second lifetime added to the average citizen. Just pause and internalize what that means for a society.
It's profound.
If the culturally understood life expectancy is 43 years old, your time horizon for everything is brutally short. Your incentive to spend a decade in higher education is minimal.
Why study until you're 25 if you might die at 40?
Exactly. And your incentive to meticulously save 10% of your income for a 30-year retirement is basically non-existent. You live fast, you deploy capital immediately, and you rely on having lots of kids to care for you in your brief old age.
But the extension to a 77-year lifespan fundamentally alters the incentive structure of human existence.
Right.
It creates the modern concept of retirement, which, in turn, necessitates the creation of sophisticated financial markets, pension funds, life insurance, long-term bond markets.
Because you suddenly have decades of non-working life to fund.
Exactly. And people begin to invest heavily in their own skill development because they know they have a 40-year career ahead of them to recoup that investment.
But here's where the data reveals a darker, more complex reality of living longer. Slide 9 breaks down what they call the epidemiological shift.
The transition in the cause of death.
Yeah. The data uses this left-right donut chart to visualize a massive transformation in the death spectrum. It tracks the shrinking percentage of deaths caused by infectious diseases and maternal or nutritional issues. But as those drop away,
There's a massive expansion in deaths caused by non-communicable diseases.
right, the shift from the diseases of poverty to the diseases of affluence.
Exactly. We're talking about cardiovascular disease, various cancers, and metabolic disorders like type 2 diabetes dominating the 30 to 70 age bracket.
And why does that shift happen so predictably?
Well, when a population is largely rural and agrarian, the primary threats are communicable. You die from cholera outbreaks due to tainted water or malaria or tuberculosis or complications during childbirth.
Because the infrastructure isn't there.
Right. But when a country urbanizes, modernizes its sanitation grid, and rolls out universal basic vaccines, those infectious vectors are neutralized.
Yeah,
But then the environmental reality of the new economy takes
a
hold.
sedentary lifestyle.
Yes. People move from highly active physical labor in the fields to sedentary desk jobs. Their diets shift from unprocessed local crops to highly processed, calorie-dense, urban convenience foods.
It's fast food, basically.
And most crucially, they simply live long enough for their cellular biology to degrade in complex ways. You don't live long enough to develop late-stage oncology needs if you die of malaria at age 30.
Right, this brings up a massive structural friction. We just celebrated the fact that citizens are living 33 years longer, and they're highly educated, salaried workers.
Mm-hmm.
But if they're living long enough to get heart disease and stroke and cancer, doesn't that put an entirely new, incredibly expensive burden on the healthcare system right as the population's getting older?
It does.
I mean, treating cholera is relatively cheap, right? You need clean water and basic antibiotics. But treating a population of tens of millions for chronic cardiovascular disease requires MRIs and highly specialized surgical teams and decades of expensive pharmaceutical management.
It's a completely different scale of expense.
Right. So how does an economy manage that explosive new cost burden? Right as the old age dependency ratio is crossing that 15.9% red line we talked about earlier.
That is the defining paradox of the late demographic dividend era. The state has successfully solved the cheap, fast-acting public health crises and graduated to the astronomically expensive, slow-moving crises.
It's like a punishment for success.
In a way, yes. It demands a complete teardown and rebuild of the national healthcare infrastructure. The system must pivot from acute, localized interventions to widespread, lifelong chronic management. It is immensely expensive, and it requires continuous, high-level economic growth to sustain.
Which naturally leads to the question of funding. How did these LTE nations generate the staggering amounts of capital required to build modern hospitals and double their secondary education capacity and fund that 13 times GDP growth?
They couldn't do it simply by selling services to themselves.
No, they had to look outward.
Exactly. They had to integrate aggressively into the global macroeconomic machine, which brings us to the global footprint data.
Yes, section 4. Slides 10 through 12. The data tracking this global integration is stark. Trade as a percentage of GDP starts at a relatively insular 11.6%.
Very domestically focused.
Right. But as the demographic dividend kicks in, that number violently swings upward. It eventually hovers in the high 40 to 60% range. These nations fundamentally lash themselves to the hull of global value chains.
Because you cannot engineer a 13x economic expansion through domestic consumption alone, especially when your population is still accumulating its initial wealth.
They just didn't have the cash to buy their own stuff yet.
Right. You have to export. You leverage your massive, newly urbanized 71.5% working age population, and you offer them to the developed world as the ultimate manufacturing engine.
You become the world's factory floor.
You become the factory floor for North America and Europe, and eventually, as your human capital upgrades, as we discussed with the education data, you become the technology and service hub.
But plugging into the global economy at that scale carries a heavy environmental price tag.
A brutal physical toll.
The researchers map out the environmental cost of this economic miracle on slide 11, and the visual data is genuinely intimidating. It's this dark gray stepped area, chart tracking total absolute carbon dioxide emissions, excluding LUL-UCF, so just raw industrial output.
And the trend.
It is a steep, dark, almost perfectly straight upward climb, capped with a stark warning circle around the massive total emissions at the top. The absolute carbon footprint of these transitioning economies skyrockets in tandem with their GDP.
It is the inescapable physics of rapid industrialization. When you are migrating millions of people into cities, you are pouring millions of tons of concrete.
Which is hugely carbon intensive.
Massive. You are firing up massive coal and gas plants to power the new manufacturing hubs. You are electrifying grids that previously did not exist. The absolute carbon emission of the LTE group is one of the most pressing dilemmas in contemporary global economics.
But, and this is fascinating, the data set presents a countermetric right next to that surging emissions chart. Slide 12 shows that while total absolute emissions are climbing aggressively, the carbon intensity of the economy is actually plunging.
Right.
The chart overlays a pale bar chart for GDP growth with a dark, downward trending line for carbon intensity. And it shows intensity, which is measured as kilograms of CO2 equivalent emitted per dollar of GDP, being essentially cut in half.
Marked with a prominent downward arrow.
Yes, it drops from 1.35 down to 0.66.
This is the macroeconomic phenomenon of relative decoupling.
Let me try to visualize relative decoupling for the listener, because it can feel contradictory, right? Seeing emissions going up while intensity goes down.
It trips a lot of people up.
It's like upgrading your old gas guzzler to a highly efficient hybrid car. You take your old sputtering truck and replace it with a state-of-the-art hybrid. Your miles per gallon is fantastic now.
You're burning half the fuel per mile.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But because your business is booming, because you're experiencing 13 times GDP growth, you went from driving 10 miles a week to 1,000 miles a week.
Ah, right.
So you're way more efficient per mile, but you are still burning way more total gas than you were before.
That captures the mechanics of it perfectly. The domestic economy of the LTE country is getting remarkably greener on a per-dollar basis. Their newly built factories use cutting-edge thermal efficiency. Their newly laid electrical grids have less transmission loss than older Western grids.
They're adopting renewable energy faster too, right?
Much faster than legacy economies. But because they're generating 13 times more dollars, the sheer volume of output overwhelms the efficiency gains. Total emissions still go up.
Which raises a highly contentious question, and I want to push back a little here regarding global accountability.
Okay.
If trade is making up over 50% of their GDP, and they are heavily reliant on exporting manufactured goods, aren't they essentially just acting as the carbon proxy for the developed world?
That's the big debate.
Right. Like, is that massive spike in absolute carbon emissions really their footprint? Or is it fundamentally the footprint of the wealthier nations who are demanding, purchasing, and consuming the millions of flat-screen TVs, smartphones, and fast fashion garments rolling off those assembly lines?
You have just articulated the central friction of every modern international climate negotiation.
It seems unfair to just pin the number on them.
Well, there is a deep divide between geographic production accounting and global consumption accounting. However, looking strictly through the lens of the macro data presented by these researchers, the metrics are geographic.
So it just measures where the smoke physically goes into the air.
Exactly. The raw emissions physically occur within the borders of the LTE nation. Those emissions are a byproduct of powering the domestic grid, which provides the salaries for the newly formalized workforce, which in turn drives the domestic 13x GDP growth. The data reflects the physical reality of production, regardless of where the end consumer lives.
I see. So it's an inherent structural cost of their chosen development model, even if it's servicing foreign demand.
Precisely.
Okay, so we've seen the wealth, the health, and the environmental cost. But let's look at the cracks in the foundation, because the final section of this dataset, slides 13 and 14, strips away the triumph to look at the hidden frictions.
The groups being left behind.
Right, because despite the booming economy, two major demographics are facing severe systemic friction.
Rapid macroeconomic transformation always generates structural pain. An economy is a massive, complex organism. It does not evolve uniformly. And in the post-dividend era, the groups absorbing the brunt of that uneven evolution are the youth and the female workforce.
The youth employment data is deeply concerning. The researchers vividly describe this on slide 13. It's a fluctuating line chart tracking unemployment for the 15 to 24 age demographic.
And there's a specific threshold they mark.
Yeah, they highlight this stark red dashed line marking the 14% danger water level. And the data shows actual youth unemployment climbing from single digits and then stubbornly bobbing above this danger zone, plateauing in a high band between 14.2% and 15.7%.
This is the quintessential structural pain of the late demographic dividend.
But this is the ultimate paradox to me.
Why?
We just established that this exact generation benefited from the massive education boom. Primary completion is at 90%, secondary enrollment doubled. You have the most highly educated, literate, and theoretically capable youth generation in the history of the country.
That's true.
They're entirely unburdened by the agrarian past. So why are they the ones struggling the most to find employment? Shouldn't the modern service economy be fighting tooth and nail to hire them?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the paradox resolves when you look at the velocity of the two different systems.
Right.
Think of it like a massive IT infrastructure upgrade. The national economy has rapidly upgraded its hardware. It has moved up the value chain from basic, low-skill manufacturing to complex logistics, advanced services, and high-tech industry.
Right.
However, the education system, the software running on that hardware, is notoriously slow to update. Universities and secondary schools take years to design new curricula, train professors, and graduate students.
Oh, I see. So a diploma doesn't automatically create a job.
Exactly. As the economy moves up the value chain, the types of jobs available change, creating a mismatch between what universities teach and what modern services require.
So the economy is demanding highly specific, niche technical skills, but the institutions are still churning out graduates with broad, generalized degrees optimized for the economy of 10 years ago.
Precisely. The expanding high-value service sectors, finance, advanced IT, specialized engineering demand applicants with highly applied skills or years of specific experience. The newly minted graduates possess immense potential but lack the exact frictional requirements of the updated economy.
So you get a massive bottleneck of educated, ambitious youth trapped in a holding pattern.
Exactly. And the data on slide 14 shows a similar, incredibly stubborn bottleneck regarding gender. The failure to fully integrate women means the country is fighting with one hand tied behind its back.
The researchers track female labor participation here using flat bar charts, and they highlight a severe gap,
They utilize the NEAT metric to illustrate this.
which stands for not in education, employment, or training. Right.
Correct.
And the historical data points show female NEAT rates hitting highs of 15% in earlier data, with significant gaps lingering into the present. There's a persistent structural barrier preventing the full realization of female economic power. It's this massive untapped gender dividend.
And this is where the LTE nations face their greatest vulnerability regarding the middle income trap.
How so?
When your working age population hits that 71.5% peak and mathematically begins to shrink, your era of extensive labor-driven growth is permanently over. You simply do not have a surplus of human bodies anymore. In that environment, failing to fully integrate the female demographic into the high-value formal economy is devastating. Unlocking that female labor potential is no longer just a sociological goal regarding equality. It transforms into a hard, non-negotiable macroeconomic imperative.
Because they need the tax base.
Exactly. If these nations are going to sustain the tax base required to fund the chronic healthcare needs of their aging population, to manage that rising 15.9% elderly dependency ratio, they need maximum participation from every capable adult.
Which brings us to the outro, the final summary on slide 15.
The strategic outlook.
Yeah. And visually, this slide is totally clean. No messy data. Just 3 perfectly spaced boxes with flat minimalist icons. An hourglass for population, a book for education, and a gear and leaf for the industrial environmental friction.
Distilling it down to the core takeaways.
Right. The transition was ultimately a success, but it puts the country at a crossroads. The researchers synthesized decades of macro transformation into three core realities. First, the quantity dividend ends.
Labor peaks. The raw demographic engine that propelled them is receding.
Second, the quality dividend takes over. The survival of the economy now relies entirely on the 77-year lifespans and the higher education boom to generate enough value.
And third, the dual threat of the future.
Navigating that 15% youth unemployment while facing crushing carbon reduction pressure.
It is an incredibly precarious crossroads. The transition from agrarian survival to modern industrialization was undeniably successful. But the challenges of maintaining a modernized, aging society are vastly more complex than the challenges of building one.
So bringing this all out of the abstract macro data and into the real world, what does this all mean for you, the listener? Why should you care about the dependency ratio or the carbon intensity of these LTE nations?
You should care because these LTE nations currently operate as the physical engine room of the modern global economy. Their internal macroeconomic friction is a global event. If they fail to smoothly transition to a quality dividend, if they get stuck in the middle income trap, weighed down by youth unemployment and an aging crisis, it will violently disrupt global supply chains.
It'll dictate the price of goods in your local store.
Exactly. It will dictate baseline inflation worldwide. Furthermore, their success or failure in managing their absolute carbon footprint will single-handedly dictate the mathematical reality of international climate goals.
Their demographic hangover is going to be felt in the price, availability, and environmental cost of almost everything we consume.
It's a totally interconnected system.
It really is. But, analyzing the sheer scale of the demographic cheat code, these nations utilized that perfect temporary crossing of the dependency scissors that flooded their banks with free capital and allowed them to build their megacity.
Yeah.
It leaves me with a very unsettling, kind of provocative thought about the future, something that isn't directly answered by these slides. If that massive demographic quantity dividend was a one-time historical cheat code, the fundamental ladder, that allowed these LTE nations to climb out of poverty and build their wealth, what happens to the next wave of developing countries? Right? If AI and advanced robotics make cheap manufacturing labor obsolete over the next 20 years, will the next generation of countries even get the chance to cash in their demographic dividend, or has the ladder just been pulled up behind these LTE nations permanently?
That is a deeply complex structural dilemma and definitely the essential question for the next era of global economics.
Something to mull over. Until next time.